My brother called a family meeting the same week our father was buried. He said it was about settling the estate. He smiled the whole time he said it. I knew then that whatever was in that conference room wasn't going to be good for me. Let me back up. My name is Nora. I'm 28 years old. I work as a paralegal at a mid-size firm in Columbus, Ohio. The kind of job where you learn very quickly that the law is a language, and if you don't speak it, people will use it against you. I learned that lesson professionally. I never thought I'd have to apply it to my own family. My father, Eugene, was a quiet man. A retired electrician who spent 35 years pulling wire through walls in office buildings downtown. He wasn't flashy. He drove the same Ford pickup for 12 years. He brought coffee in a thermos from home instead of stopping at Starbucks. He had a vegetable garden in the backyard that he tended the way some men tend to their cars, with patience and an almost embarrassing amount of pride. Every August, he'd show up by my apartment with a paper bag full of tomatoes and zucchini. And he'd stand there in my doorway, looking like he'd handed me gold. He was diagnosed with stage 3 colon cancer, 14 months before he died. I found out because he called me himself on a Tuesday morning while I was eating lunch at my desk. He told me the same way he told me everything, matter-of-factly, no dramatic pause, no softening the blow. Nora, the doctors say it's cancer. I wanted you to know first. See, it's cancer. I wanted you to know first. Before my brother Fletcher. Before my sister-in-law Amber. Before my aunts and cousins and the neighbors who'd known him for 20 years. Me, first. I think about that a lot now. Fletcher lived 40 minutes away in a bigger house in Dublin with Amber and their 2 kids. He worked in commercial real estate. He was the kind of man who wore a Rolex to a cookout and found ways to mention his commission in casual conversation. He and my father had a cordial relationship, Sunday dinners. The occasional game on TV, but Fletcher had a habit of being too busy. Too busy to drive Dad to chemo. Too busy to sit in the waiting room. Too busy to learn which anti-nausea medication worked and which one made Dad feel worse. I was the one who rearranged my schedule. I took Tuesdays and Thursdays off remote. My boss allowed it because I'd never asked for anything in 4 years. I drove 40 minutes each way, twice a week, for 14 months. I learned the names of every nurse on Dad's oncology floor. I learned to read a CBC report. I learned that Dad liked ginger ale, but only if it was cold, and that he hated the hospital blankets, so I brought one from home that had been his mother's, pale yellow with a loose knit that had softened over 50 years of washing. Fletcher showed up 6 times. I counted, not because I was keeping score. I genuinely wasn't at the beginning, but because after a while I noticed. You couldn't not notice. Amber called once a week, always on Sunday evenings, always for exactly 12 minutes. I know because Dad mentioned it, almost apologetically, like he was embarrassed for them. When Dad's condition got serious, when serious stopped being a euphemism and started being a timeline, he asked me to stay, not just visit. Stay. I gave up my apartment lease in February. I moved my things into my childhood bedroom, the one with the blue striped wallpaper I'd always hated, and the window that stuck in the cold. I didn't complain about either. Those last 4 months were the hardest and the strangest of my life. There is an intimacy to caring for a dying parent that nobody talks about honestly. It changes you in ways that are not clean or poetic. You learn things about another person. About their body, their fears, the sounds they make at 3 a.m. when the pain wakes them up. That you can never unknow. And you carry it even now, months later, when you're standing in a grocery store and a song comes on that he used to whistle, and you have to put down whatever's in your hands and breathe through your nose for a count of 8. Dad died on a Sunday, which felt right somehow. He was a Sunday kind of man. The funeral was on a Wednesday. Fletcher gave a eulogy that was well written and received a lot of nods. Amber cried in a way that was visible from the back pew. I sat in the front row and held Dad's sister, my Aunt Polly, who is 71 and has bad knees, and I focused on not falling apart until I was alone. The family meeting was scheduled for the following Saturday. I remember thinking it was scheduled for the following Saturday. I remember thinking it was soon. I remember thinking a lot of things that week. Fletcher had set it up himself. Sent a calendar invite from his real estate email account with the subject line, Estate Discussion, Weston Family. He'd booked a conference room at his firm because, as he put it, it's more professional. There was something in that choice that bothered me, though I couldn't have named it cleanly at the time. Now I can. It was a performance of authority. He was staging the room to make himself the one in charge. I arrived 5 minutes early. Fletcher and Amber were already there. Fletcher had printed documents, multiple sets, paper-clipped, arranged in a neat stack in front of the empty seats. He was smiling. Amber had her hands folded on the table like she was waiting for a presentation to start. She was dressed like it was a client meeting. I was in jeans and a cardigan, because my father had been dead for 9 days and I did not have the bandwidth to think about my outfit. We waited for Aunt Polly. She arrived a few minutes late, apologizing, her cane clicking on the tile floor. Fletcher stood and pulled out her chair with the kind of deliberate courtesy that meant he wanted something from her. "Thanks for coming, everyone," he started, as if he were opening a sales call. "I know this is hard. I wanted to get us all on the same page about Dad's estate so we can move forward. Move forward." Dad had been dead for 9 days. I set my coffee cup down quietly and waited. Fletcher explained that Dad had died with some assets: the house, a savings account, the pickup truck, some personal items. The house, he said, had been appraised. He slid a printed page toward me. I looked at the number. It was a conservative estimate, probably $60,000 under market value, but I didn't say anything yet. "The thing is," Fletcher said, leaning back in his chair, "Amber and I have been talking, and we think the most practical move is to sell the house and liquidate the savings account. Split it evenly." He paused. "Obviously, after we factor in certain costs?" "What costs?" Aunt Polly asked. "The mortgage is still carrying a small balance," he said. "Closing costs when we sell." "My time managing the estate." "That's a real cost, Polly. Estate administrators typically charge a percentage." He said it smoothly, like it was perfectly reasonable, like I wasn't sitting right there. "Also, we were thinking that since the house needs some work before listing, I can coordinate that through my network, at a standard contractor rate." I looked at him. He was going to charge the estate for his own time managing the estate, use his commission from the sale of our father's house, and pocket the difference from the low appraisal he'd already arranged. "Fletcher," I said, keeping my voice even, "who's named as executor in Dad's will?" He blinked. Just briefly. "I am. Dad asked me to take it on." "And the will has been filed with the probate court?" "We're getting there," he said. "That's why we're having this meeting. To align before we start the formal process." Align. I'd worked for lawyers for 4 years. I knew what align before the formal process meant in a family context. It meant, agree to my version before anyone looks too closely. "How much is in the savings account?" I asked. Another blink. "Around 80,000. "Around?" I'd have to pull the exact number. I nodded slowly. "And what's the total estate value you're working from for the executor fee calculation?" Amber shifted in her seat. Fletcher straightened. "Nora, I know this is a lot to take in. Grief does things to our thinking. Maybe we should table the financial specifics for today and just—" "I'm a paralegal, Fletcher." I said it without heat, without drama. "I process estate documents for a living. I'm not asking you to comfort me. I'm asking you to comfort me. I'm asking you for the numbers." The room went quiet. Aunt Polly was watching me with an expression I'd seen once before, years ago, when she'd caught a contractor overcharging my grandmother for a furnace repair. It was the expression of a woman who recognized something being done wrong and was waiting to see who was going to say it out loud. I said it out loud. "The executor fee in Ohio is set by statute," I said. "It's a percentage of the estate value. If you're calculating it, it needs to be based on a proper inventory, filed with the court, not a pre-meeting estimate." I looked at the appraisal sheet. "And this appraisal, who ordered it?" "I did," Fletcher said. "It's a licensed appraiser." "Which firm?" he told me. I recognized the name. They had a referral relationship with his real estate brokerage. I didn't say that part yet. What I said was, "I'm going to need copies of everything. The will, the account statements, the appraisal order, any contracts you've already signed with contractors." I paused. "And I'd like to know before we go any further, has Dad's estate attorney been contacted?" "Dad didn't have an estate attorney," Fletcher said, a little too quickly. "He had a will. He used a legal services website. It's a simple document." I took a sip of my coffee. I'd like to see it. There was a silence that lasted too long for a room full of adults sitting around a table. I don't have it with me, Fletcher said finally. That's fine. Email it to me this afternoon. Fletcher looked at Amber. Amber looked at her hands. I could feel Aunt Polly breathing next to me, slow and steady, not saying a word. Here's what I hadn't told anyone at that table. Here's the part I'd been sitting with for 3 weeks, turning over quietly in my mind the way you turn over a stone to see what's underneath it. The day before Dad went into his final hospital stay, the stay he didn't come home from, he'd asked me to bring him a metal lockbox from the top shelf of his bedroom closet. He'd been clear-headed that morning, the kind of clear-headed that comes and goes in the last weeks of a serious illness, where for a few hours the person you know is entirely back and looking at you like they're trying to memorize your face. He opened the lockbox with a small brass key he wore on a chain around his neck. Inside was a folder. Inside the folder were documents. I need you to understand something, he'd said. He spoke slowly but steadily. I changed my will 2 years ago, the one Fletcher knows about. I let him think that's the current one. It's not. After your mother left, after I watched what Fletcher did with her estate, the corners he cut, the numbers he moved, I made some changes. I wasn't going to say anything, but then I got sick and I watched you show up every Tuesday and Thursday and I thought, she needs to know. He handed me the folder. The will in that folder had been drafted by a real attorney, a woman named Patricia Hartwell, based in Westerville, who specialized in estate planning. It had been notarized. It had been filed as a codicil with the probate court 18 months before Dad died, which meant it superseded any prior version. The house was to be sold and the proceeds split, yes. But after a specific carve-out, $120,000 from the savings account was to go directly to me in recognition of primary caregiver contributions over the 14-month course of my illness. Dad's words. He'd written them himself. Patricia had told me that when I called her, 2 days after the funeral, without telling anyone. The executor was not Fletcher. The executor was Patricia Hartwell herself. Fletcher had never been told about the codicil. Dad had been very deliberate about that. I had been carrying this information around for 3 weeks, like something fragile, trying to figure out the right moment. The right moment turned out to be a conference room in a real estate office, 9 days after my father's funeral, with my brother sliding low-ball appraisals across the table and talking about aligning before the formal process. I reached into my bag and pulled out a manila envelope. Before we go any further, I said, I think you should know that Dad's estate already has an executor, one that was filed with the Franklin County Probate Court 18 months ago. Fletcher's smile didn't disappear. It froze. There's a difference. What are you talking about? He said. Dad updated his will. I have a copy here. I slid the envelope across the table. The estate attorney is Patricia Hartwell in Westerville. She's been notified of Dad's passing. She'll be contacting both of us through formal channels. Fletcher didn't touch the envelope. That's not, Dad didn't have an attorney. He used an online service. He used an online service to write the first version, I said. The one he showed you. He hired Miss Hartwell for the update. It was filed as a codicil. Codicils supersede. I looked at him calmly. You'd know that if you'd spoken to the probate court before scheduling this meeting. Nora. His voice had changed. The sales call smoothness was gone. Nora, if Dad made changes, it was probably, look, the end of his life was confusing for him. He was on a lot of medication. Whatever he thought he was doing, he was of sound mind when he signed it, I said. Patricia will confirm that. She documented it specifically because she anticipated someone might raise that question. Aunt Polly made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a cough. I want to see it, Fletcher said. You will. Through proper channels. That's how estate law works. I picked up my coffee. You told me earlier that Dad didn't have an estate attorney. I'm wondering if that was something you actually believed, or something you said because you thought I didn't know the difference. Fletcher stood up. You're doing this on purpose, he said, voice low and tight. You spent a year up there playing nurse so you could, position yourself? Manipulate a sick old man? I had expected something like this. I had run through it in my head at 3 in the morning several times in the past 3 weeks, rehearsing my own reaction, wondering if I'd cry or freeze or say something I'd regret. I didn't do any of those things. I spent 14 months driving Dad to chemotherapy, managing his medications, coordinating with his doctors, sleeping in the next room with the baby monitor on so I could hear if he needed help in the night, I said quietly. I did it because he was my father. I didn't do it to be in his will. I didn't know the codicil existed until the day before he died. I looked at my brother. But I think you knew something was missing. I think that's why you scheduled this meeting before you filed anything with the court. I think you were hoping to get everyone to agree to your version before anyone looked up the actual version. That is not what happened, he said. Then you won't mind Patricia Hartwell walking us through the actual document. I picked up my bag. I'll see you at the formal reading. I stood up. Aunt Polly stood up. She patted my arm once, twice, without saying a word, and we walked out together. The next 3 weeks were not quiet. Fletcher called me 4 times the first day. I let them go to voicemail. His tone shifted with each one. The first was angry, the second was explanatory, the third was almost apologetic, the fourth was angry again. Amber texted me to say that I was tearing the family apart and that Dad would have wanted us to handle this privately. I thought about the 12-minute Sunday calls and did not respond. Cousins I hadn't seen at Christmas started texting. The word selfish appeared more than once. Someone, I suspect Amber, had framed the situation to the extended family as me, withholding Dad's estate from my grieving brother. Nobody asked for my version. They didn't need to. The narrative was already running without me. I stopped reading the texts. I focused on what I could control. Patricia Hartwell turned out to be exactly the kind of attorney my father deserved. Precise, unhurried, with a dry sense of humor that surfaced in odd moments. She walked me through the estate process step by step. She had, as Dad predicted, anticipated challenges. The documentation for the codicil was thorough. Dad's sound mind at signing had been attested by 2 witnesses who were not family members, and Patricia had taken notes on his stated intentions that day. Detailed notes, in case anyone later claimed confusion. There was one detail I hadn't known, even with the copy of the codicil Dad had given me. Patricia told me about it calmly over the phone, on a Thursday afternoon when I was sitting in my car in the parking lot of a Kroger. Your father also kept a record, she said, of financial assistance he provided to your brother over the years. Loans, technically, they were documented as such, with promissory notes, though your brother may not have understood that's what he was signing. I was quiet. How much? I asked. Patricia told me, the total, with the interest rate Dad had specified. Modest, lower than a bank would charge, because he was a generous man even in his caution, was $94,000. Fletcher had borrowed $94,000 from my father over the course of 8 years, in increments, for things that had been explained as investment opportunities, a business expansion, a cash flow problem during a market slowdown. Each time Dad had lent it quietly and without complaint. Each time Fletcher had made vague assurances about paying it back when things stabilized. Things apparently never stabilized. The estate documents specified that any outstanding personal loans to beneficiaries must be settled from their share of the estate before distribution. This was standard language, Patricia explained. It was also language that effectively meant Fletcher's share was already substantially claimed. When Patricia informed Fletcher of the outstanding loans, he said they were gifts. Patricia produced the promissory notes. Dad had notarized 2 of them. He'd kept the signed copies in that same lockbox. Gifts, it turned out, were not the word for them. I drove to Aunt Polly's house on a Sunday afternoon about a month after the formal estate process began. She lived in a small ranch house in Hilliard, and she kept a bowl of butterscotch candies on the coffee table that she'd been replenishing for as long as I could remember. I took one when I sat down. It felt important to take a butterscotch candy in that particular living room at that particular moment, like a small act of continuity. I told her everything. The codicil, the loans, Patricia, the promissory notes. She listened without interrupting, which is something she does that I've always respected. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Eugene told me some of this, she said finally. Not all of it. But he told me he was going to protect you. I had to look at the ceiling for a second. Did he tell you about Fletcher? I asked. He said Fletcher was a man who confused wanting something with deserving it. She reached over and patted my knee. That's as close as your father ever came to talking badly about his own child. He loved that boy. But he saw him clearly. I nodded. He saw you clearly too, she said. I took another butterscotch candy and didn't say anything for a while. The formal estate reading happened on a gray Tuesday in November. Patricia's office was on the second floor of a building downtown, with a view of the street below and a conference table that was real wood, not laminate. Fletcher and Amber came together. They sat on one side of the table. I sat on the other. Aunt Polly was there as a witness. She'd been named in the will for a specific personal item, a piece of jewelry that had belonged to my grandmother, which Dad had carefully earmarked for her. Fletcher had a different attorney with him, someone he'd hired in the past month. The presence of a second attorney in the room seemed to shift something in the air, an acknowledgement, without words, that this had become something formal and contested. Patricia walked through the document without editorial comment. She was efficient and thorough. When she got to the section about outstanding loans, Fletcher's attorney raised an objection that Patricia dispatched in 2 sentences, citing Ohio estate law, case reference included. Fletcher was looking at the table. When Patricia finished, Amber leaned over and said something to Fletcher that I couldn't hear. He shook his head once. The number that would go to me, after the house sale, after probate fees, after Fletcher's loan balance was offset against his share, was substantial, not life-changing in the way people describe in movies, but enough to matter. Enough to do the things I'd been deferring for years while spending my savings on gas money for chemo runs and groceries for a man who couldn't always eat what he bought. Fletcher looked at me once before he left. Not with hatred exactly. With something more complicated. The look of someone who knows they were caught not because they were unlucky but because they were wrong, and who hasn't yet decided whether they're angry about the outcome or about themselves. He didn't say anything. Amber said, "I hope you're proud of yourself," on the way out the door. I wasn't proud, I wasn't gloating. I was just tired and a little sad and deeply relieved in a way that felt too private to explain to anyone who'd been on the other side of that table. Aunt Polly waited until they were gone. Then she picked up her purse, straightened her jacket, and said, "Lunch?" We went to a diner on 5th Street that had been there since before either of us was born, and ordered the soup and a grilled cheese, and sat in a booth by the window. She told me a story about my father as a teenager that I had never heard before. Something about a car, and a very bad decision, and my grandfather's reaction. Funny in retrospect. Mortifying at the time. I laughed for the first time in 2 months. The estate closed 4 months later. The house sold. At market value, listed through an agent who had no referral relationship with anyone at the table. Dad's truck went to a neighbor who'd admired it for years. Patricia handled that quietly, per Dad's specific written instructions. The lockbox and its brass key I kept. I did some things with the money that my father would have understood. I cleared my student loan balance, which I'd been chipping at for 6 years. I put a down payment on a small house, not big, not flashy. The kind that needs some work, which suits me fine. It has a backyard. In the spring, I put in a vegetable garden. The first time I grew tomatoes, they were ugly and a little misshapen and tasted better than anything I'd eaten in years. I texted Aunt Polly a picture. She sent back a single butterscotch candy emoji, which is not a real emoji, but somehow she found it anyway. I don't have a relationship with Fletcher now. That door isn't locked, technically. I haven't said it's over permanently, because I don't think it is mine to say alone. But it's closed, and I'm not the one who closed it. That's the part people sometimes get wrong when they ask about family estrangements. They assume someone slammed a door. Sometimes nobody slams anything. Sometimes you just both walk to opposite sides of a room and neither of you walks back. And the space between you just becomes the new architecture. I think about my father a lot. I think about a Tuesday morning, eating lunch at my desk, and a phone ringing, and a man who told his daughter first. I think about yellow blankets and ginger ale, and the way he'd stand in my doorway with a paper bag full of vegetables looking like he brought gold. I think about a lockbox, a brass key, a folder of documents that said, in the careful formal language of legal instruments, what he couldn't quite bring himself to say out loud in any of the language we used between us, that he saw me, that he knew, that he had made sure I would be okay. That is the thing about a parent who loves you quietly. They prepare for you even when you're not watching, even when you're driving them to chemotherapy. Even when you're reading labels on nausea medication. Even when you're folding a yellow blanket in the dark. They are still preparing for you. And one day, when you need it most, you open a box and find out. I'd thought a lot about what made all of this possible. Not the legal documents, not the codicil, not Patricia Hartwell's careful notes. Those were instruments. What made it possible was a series of choices. Mine, my father's, my brother's, stretching back years before any of us sat down in that conference room. Fletcher made his choices steadily, over a long time. He chose to show up 6 times in 14 months. He chose to take money he called gifts that were actually loans. He chose to schedule a meeting before filing anything with the court because some part of him understood that speed and confusion were on his side, and daylight was not. Those weren't unlucky decisions. They were a pattern, and patterns eventually produce outcomes that match them. I made my choices too. I drove on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I learned which nausea medication worked. I stayed when it was hard and kept going when it got harder. I didn't do those things strategically. I did them because my father needed someone to do them and I was the person who showed up. But what I understand now is that integrity isn't a performance you put on when people are watching. It's just what you do when no one is keeping score. And it turns out people notice anyway. The right people. The quiet ones. The ones keeping careful records in lockboxes. My father noticed. That's the thing I keep coming back to. He was a man of very few words when it came to emotion. He did not say, "I love you," the way some fathers do, casually and often. He said it the way he did everything else, through action, through presence, through a level of deliberate care that only becomes legible after the fact. The codicil was his version of saying it. The promissory notes, the notarized signatures, the specific language about caregiving contributions. That was him, in the only language he fully trusted, telling me that he saw what I was doing and he was not going to let it be erased. I think about what would have happened if I hadn't known. If I'd walked into that conference room without the folder. If I'd signed something I didn't understand because I was grieving and tired and someone I grew up trusting told me it was the right thing to do. It would have worked. Fletcher's plan was not a bad plan. It just assumed I was someone who didn't read documents closely, who didn't know the difference between an executor fee and a commission, who could be moved through the process quickly before she had time to think. He forgot what I did for a living. He also forgot, and this is the part I find myself returning to, that the person who stays in the hard situation long enough always learns more than the person who avoids it. I knew that house. I knew those filing cabinets. I knew the brass key on the chain around my father's neck because I had helped him put it on every morning for 4 months. Knowledge like that doesn't come from ambition. It comes from showing up. There's something I want to say plainly, because I think people sometimes tell stories like this and make them sound like victories, clean and satisfying. This wasn't clean. I lost my brother, functionally. Even if the door isn't locked, I sat across a table from someone I grew up with and watched him look at me with something I can only describe as the face of a person who got caught. And it did not feel like winning. It felt like grief wearing a different coat. What I have now is something quieter than victory. I have a house with a backyard. I have a garden that produces ugly, perfect tomatoes every August. I have the memory of a man who drove a 12-year-old truck and brought vegetables to my door like they were gold, and who, in the end, made sure the people who loved him honestly were not left with nothing. That is what integrity costs, and what it earns. It costs you the easy road. It earns you the real one. I take that trade every time.